Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow here at Carnegie, looking at this Newsweek, Nick, of a presidential visit to Ukraine, a historic visit, many discussions at the Munich Security Conference, and a great deal of question about what is happening next as we reach the first anniversary of the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Today, we are honored that Dr. Alexander Vindman, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and former Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council and Director of the Institute for Informed American Leadership at the Vet Voice Foundation, is going to join us to try to figure out where we are today and what we can expect over the next maybe year, if we can do that, in this ongoing war, in this upheaval in geopolitics, in a very important time. And let's start to now. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex. We so appreciate you taking that time in your busy schedule, and also thank you for your service to our country. We want to say that from the bottom of our hearts. We are approaching and in the week of the one-year anniversary of the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we wanted to take a moment to reflect on the year and what's to come. I know many outlets have done that, and certainly there was a big surprise with President Biden going to Ukraine on Monday and meeting with Zelenskyy in a show of that garnered so much exuberance. I mean, my WhatsApp was blowing up with family, friends, reporters from Poland, from Ukraine, emailing me all sorts of euphoric pictures. And though I am the optimist in this podcast versus Nick's somewhat pessimism, I want to ask you, is this exuberance real? And when I say that, I'm particularly struck by a sentence in your latest foreign affairs piece. The next 6 months will witness a great deal of human tragedy. And reports just from yesterday from the ministry in Ukraine of Russian targeting 11 attacks in 3 eastern regions, and the complete suffering and tremendous refugee crisis that sometimes doesn't get spoken about in the news. I'm wondering if this euphoria is just that, or have we reached a point where there is a real resolve to provide the support that Ukraine needs and not be slow about offering aid and help?
Well, Tatiana, first let me say that I think I'm the biggest optimist on this in this discussion. The answer is that there should be optimism over the future, but we should recognize the difficult road ahead. The country of Ukraine, the largest country in Europe, more than 1,000 kilometers east to west, a population of 45 million is basically been put into an enormous amount of turmoil. It's been in a state of war for 9 years, but the past year has witnessed a full-scale war from Russia. It's resulted in some 8 million people fleeing Ukraine to live overseas, another 5 million displaced persons. So that's a significant portion of Ukraine's population that's been displaced and whose lives have been thrown into chaos. The human toll in terms of casualties, deaths, and injuries has been enormous. Tens of thousands killed and injured. If you calculate the Russian losses, this was, I think, a conservative number, but Chairman Milley talked about well over 100,000 killed and severely injured. It's by Ukrainian estimates, it's probably closer to about 200,000, and I think that's not too far off the mark in terms of the scale of losses for the Russians. The Ukrainian losses are somewhat more opaque, but they've also reached levels of tens of thousands. And Russia's campaign for a large portion of the last year, due to frustration, and it will continue this way for the remainder of this war, will be to punish the civilian population because it cannot achieve its military aims fighting the Ukrainian military, so it will strike out with its dwindling resources of cruise missiles and drones at the Ukrainian population, thinking that that somehow is going to break the spirit. The visit of President Biden is momentous. We should remember that there really have not been that many visitors, presidential visitors to Ukraine since 1991, since Ukraine's independence. President Clinton visited 3 times. His last visit in 2000. President Bush visited once in 2008, in his as his second term was winding down, almost as a fourth afterthought. He did it immediately preceding that notorious NATO Bucharest summit in 2008, days before, in which, frankly, the United States and the West went too far, but not far enough. We went too far, as in we provoked Russia, but we didn't provide any of the security guarantees that would have averted or deterred Russia by granting Ukraine a membership action plan and a kind of a route to NATO membership. And then there was a long break in presidential visitors. Vice President Biden visited on multiple occasions as vice president, but President Obama and President Trump didn't visit Ukraine. And so 2008 to 2015, 2023, that's 15 years. And for a country that, by many accounts, certainly by my own assessment, was going to be probably the greatest friction point between East and West, and it was going to be a flashpoint for a broader war. That was probably evident, as if it wasn't completely evident in 2005 with the Orange Revolution, Russia asserting a desire to use military means to achieve its political aims in 2008 with Georgia, then 2014 with the first phases of this war and the annexation of portions of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass and Crimea. It was apparent, and we just didn't do too much. So President Biden gets a lot of credit for this visit, but frankly, he couldn't have avoided a visit. I mean, this was not a very closely kept secret that he was going to go there. For weeks, there were discussions about the fact that the president was likely to go there, and it made the Secret Service quite anxious. And I'm sure there was a lot of pushback from his own bureaucracy, including the Department of Defense. He ultimately made the decision to go, in part politically, in part because he's he's sophisticated. He's been in government for a long time. He understands the stakes, and he couldn't go to Poland for a second time and not cross into Ukraine. And he couldn't just simply cross the border, put a toe into Ukraine and call it good. He had to, in certain ways, follow the lead of other allies, the French, the British, in particular, have had multiple. I'm sorry. There are too many Western leaders to count, actually, at this point, that have crossed into Ukraine, traveled to Kiev. So it would have looked extremely weak, and he would have been vulnerable politically. So just to wrap this up, I think he did the right thing. He was courageous. He, in a way, tested the Russians' own resolve and this theory that Russia has zero interest in a direct confrontation with NATO. He stated to the Russians that he was going there, not asking permission, basically said, "I'm going there," and that's it. And the Russians that stayed away would not put the president's life in jeopardy. It may have very well been the safest time in Kiev since the beginning of the war.
Speaking of the optics, I think that's really important, and that's really something good the Zelenskyy administration is very good at. Taking the optics of world leaders appearing virtually at summits, but not only summits, right? At the Oscars, at the Grammys, right? At all of these different events, Zelenskyy has made his presence felt throughout the past year. And I think that, for that portion of the optics, it was a great coup, in that sense. And I look and study at the social media reaction. So that's where I'm going with this. And I think one of Zelensky's strongest points has been selling himself as this brave leader, the defense of freedom, and that has really resonated. in the West, or in particular, perhaps not in other parts of the world, but we can talk about that in a minute, but in the West in particular, in a way that, is surprising to me. So I read in Rolling Stone about the musicians that are buying drones for Ukraine, or, there's all of these subgroups that you don't typically expect to be very active in the war. Sean Penn at the Berlin Festival putting out his movie Superhero, right? Here in the US, you know what I'm waiting for? I'm waiting for my political action figure of Zelenskyy. There's this company called FCTRY, and they make these little figures. Here's Biden and Kamala. And they have a Zelenskyy figure, and it's their first international figure, right? They're these action figures, these political action figures. And I think that it's such an interesting reach of messaging. So in a sense, if there is this idea that on the ground, there's much to be done, on social media, I feel, and I want to have your feedback, there's this great big win for Ukraine on social media.
So it's well understood that Russia is highly effective at propaganda, particularly effective in the Southern Hemisphere. At times, it throws so much spaghetti at the wall. Some of it, the propaganda narrative, kind of picks up steam in European capitals. Certainly, it's kind of the cornerstone of many a conspiracy theory. But it's amazing how in this war, kind of at a critical moment, Russia has been caught flat-footed, and in fact, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has shown himself to be a master at media relations, at information operations, at basically selling facts about this war, packaging them in a way that it resonates with the Western public, with the democratic world, in a way that I don't think any other leader, maybe, if you go back to kind of niche figures during World War II, Churchill and Roosevelt were exceptionally effective, but they were effective kind of within the American and British polity, or there was some sort of crossover appeal. The fact is that I don't think there's been anybody like Zelenskyy that's been so that's garnered so much broad appeal. Maybe there's nobody else that's been better suited for it, because he's a showman and he's an actor. He's also a very, very charismatic leader. That was, when I met him, that was immediately apparent. He was endearing, earnest. A lot of these things that really kind of come to light during this war. And I think that's likely to be the case all the way through the conclusion of this war. He's emerged not just as Ukraine's leader, but and he's embraced this role, but he's the leader of the free world. So I think that's the role that he's cast for himself, and that's the role that he's going to continue to play. And I don't mean that in a kind of a pejorative way. It's an important thing for leaders to communicate with their constituencies. In this case, it's not just the Ukrainian population where he needs to maintain morale, but he needs to maintain the base of support in the Western world, and he's been extremely effective at doing that.
You've anticipated the question that I wanted to direct to you, which is sustaining support. And certainly, I think that no other Ukrainian leader, when we look at who was running for president back in 2019, if it had been another candidate elected, would have, I think, been able to play this role that Zelenskyy has, not only within Ukraine, but in terms of mobilizing this degree of international support. And just a shout out to Tatiana, whose article about Ukraine's digital strategy in Orbis is really a leading piece exploring these trends. But the question, I think, then is the sustainability question. Russian propaganda definitely was on the back foot, but one thing that I've seen coming out of Russian-connected social media channels was to do the why is Biden striding in St. Michael's Square in Kiev when he should be in East Palestine, Ohio, because of the accident, and that leads to the domestic support question. You've served in government, you've served at the White House, you are continuing your involvement in understanding the dynamics of American leadership. Do you see, or are you concerned that there could be over time a fall off of U.S. domestic support, or where Americans say we've given enough, we've done enough, we're going to turn somewhere else? Are you concerned that as we move from 23 into 2024, that what looks to be a relatively bipartisan consensus, with a few exceptions, on this will get taken over by the American election campaign, and people who are supportive today of President Biden's approach will want to be less supportive when it's a presidential election year? So your sense about the sustainability moving forward?
So I've since in government, I focused on Russia and Ukraine. Since leaving government, I worked on my doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins. I just finished my dissertation, and I guess what I'm saying is that I couldn't study this issue more closely. I basically, it was a concerted effort for a while. I was initially quite concerned about the notion of Ukraine fatigue. There certainly have been periods of Ukraine fatigue in the past. There was Ukraine fatigue that set in after 2014 relatively quickly. There was a kind of Ukraine fatigue that set in after Ukraine denuclearized in the mid 90s, in part because the rationale, the interest basis for engaging with Ukraine evaporated, and Ukraine actually took some steps in an anti-democratic direction with a growing corruption. So losing the values and the interest proposition is basically the kiss of death for foreign policy. You need to have both of those in play to have a functional relationship, at least one or the other, to have some sort of relationship. So I've been thinking about this question of Ukraine fatigue for a while. Part of my conclusion here is we are in a hyper polarized society. You cannot get two Americans to agree on pretty much anything from opposite sides of the spectrum. But in spite of this, Ukraine still enjoys overwhelming support. Even in the latest round of polling, Ukraine has probably taken a 5% dip from a massive high. It still enjoys 75% support for the American population at large, saying that we need to do more to support Ukraine. That is pretty amazing in this era of hyperpolarization. I think that what you have with Putin, both in the media coverage in Russia, but also in Putin's coverage commentary this morning, pandering to the extreme right, is preaching to the choir. That is a sliver of hardcore population. Probably the hardcore amounts to 5, maybe 10%. There's softer support that probably extends all the way out to 20%. This is the MAGA world. This is also the basis support for Trump, and frankly, in a large parts driven by former President Trump's deep animus towards Ukraine. That's not going to change. Those people are not going to be persuaded. I would say large portions of the American public are probably not going to. They might take their eye off the prize in terms of a busy agenda, including upcoming elections. But if the question is raised to them point blank, Ukraine will still enjoy a high degree of support. What I do fear a little bit is as we get into the political season, not probably through the rest of this year, but maybe about this point next year, or a little bit deeper, when we get into primary season, the moderate wing of the Republican Party is going to be attacked by the MAGA wing of the Republican Party with these anti-Ukraine, isolationist narratives. What makes me feel a little bit better about this, although this is going to be a fight, this is going to potentially jeopardize probably not the next round of funding, but the serial funding after that, is that you will have this narrative start to creep in, but a lot of these candidates fully understand that they need to curry favor with a constituency that supports Ukraine. A lot of these candidates are in places where there is a large Eastern European community, a Ukrainian community. Ohio has a massive a Ukrainian population. So I guess when all said and done, we may see something similar to the 2022 midterm elections, with a rejection of the extreme wing of the Republican Party and continued support, but under pressure. and probably with some compromises, with some calls for oversight of funding, with the executive branch being a call to account for how resources are spent. And we'll also see a different wing, a traditional wing of the Republican Party, be highly critical of the president for not doing enough. That's the Mitch McConnell, that's Rogers and McCall. More traditional Republicans saying this is the most important geopolitical event of 2024, one of the most important crises that the U.S. has faced in a generation. Why are we not doing enough? So I think it's going to be coming in from all sides, ultimately settling in a place of continued support for Ukraine, but with danger signs, and we should be alert to those danger signs. Part of my mission with my efforts with the Institute for Foreign American Leadership is to continue to explain to the American public at large why this is important. Continue to talk to Congress based on relationships built there. Continue to engage with the White House on how to potentially deliver this kind of content to the public. And that's one of the key areas that I'm focused on for the next couple of years because of the criticality to U.S. national security.
Well, one of the ways that we can deliver the message to the public is the media. Can you talk, and I'm really curious as a journalist, can you talk about how you think the media has covered Ukraine? What are some deficits? Where can we do better? What needs to be done? The beauty, I think, over the last couple of years is that so many young Ukrainians speak English and are part of the tech world. And I think that has really enabled this communication to flow into the West. But what is your analysis of media coverage and messaging, right? What more can we do with messaging?
So I guess I'll start with a broader critique of media and how our system operates. It's a pretty stark contrast when you go, to Canada or to Europe, and you hear in-depth analysis, kind of in-depth discourse around critical topics. That means that you might not be able to get to, to all the news out there, and certainly you won't get to the feel-good fluff, but you're covering the important topics in depth. And the way we do our coverage in kind of 6-minute sound bites or something like that, on the high end, isn't conducive towards analyzing information. I mean, even people that are skilled analysts of difficult topics have to communicate in short sound bites that you might get 1 or 2 or 3 ideas across, but only in wave tops. So that's just we are operating in that kind of dynamic. It makes things challenging. We have a very, very busy news cycle at any given time. We're still dealing with the aftermath of an insurrection, an effort to steal the election. We're dealing with a radicalized far right party, mainstream party that has, at least if not fully radicalized, has is significantly swayed by the far right elements, and that has to get coverage. I mean, what happens here at home is going to determine what resources we can apply abroad. No question about it. There are all sorts of other traditional issues that creep into the news cycle. So the question is, how can we continue to carve out some space for the 2 or 3 enduring, persistent threats out there and cover them consistently? There are reporters that do this exceptionally well. I mean, there are people that have been extremely focused. A friend of mine, Ali Velshi on MSNBC, has made it a point to cover Ukraine in detail. Nicole Wallace also. There are a few other folks that kind of fit in the category that have been consistently recognized the implications of this war and have covered it. But it's not ubiquitous, and certainly you have a whole media ecosystem that operates in opposition to what would be a healthy discussion, a narrative that actually would easily and has consistently fit in really, really well with the Russian media landscape. The same kinds of messages that the Russians have in their propaganda channels are carried by Fox News. it is shocking. But almost word for word, if you set aside the names and replace them with a Russian sounding name, that it would be the same thing. So that's a challenge. I guess the best that we could do is to make sure that we have a very, very skilled journalist core. We try to pick the best commentators for the topic. That's a difficult one because 24-hour news cycle means that you have to you take what you get oftentimes, and that means that oftentimes you get folks that don't have the deep experience, the regional expertise, maybe some functional expertise. You get some senior military that had some experience in the region. You get some diplomats, but you don't get too many people that could talk diplomacy, war fighting, economics, really kind of cross-cutting. So it's a challenge. I don't know. So maybe this, I talked through this whole thing, I'd settle on this one point. Maybe what networks should do or should have done at the beginning is figured out who their experts were on this topic within their cohort of journalists, and basically, have that person consistently follow the story, talk about it, as a swath of their show on a repeated basis. There are people out there. Biana Goldruga from CNN has a lot of experience in the region, understands it. There are a number of different reporters, but we just don't seem to operate that way.
Can I maybe broaden it beyond the media and just sort of ask your assessment of the analytic community as a whole? Do you think that, for many years after the Cold War, Central East Europe wasn't a particular area of study? It wasn't encouraged. Obviously, 9/11 and the war on terror reshifted our emphasis towards the Middle East, and then the pivot to Asia sent those demand signals. But are you finding, do you think, particularly you talked about you interact with members of Congress and people in the administration and elsewhere, do you think we have a cadre of regional experts and functional experts on questions like energy and economy that aren't Moscow centric in their approach, or do we have gaps, and are those gaps being filled, or do you think they'll be filled by a next generation that don't sort of see this part of the world through the starting point of Moscow?
Sure. So the answer is no, we don't have the right people. Yes, we have huge gaps, and I am modestly optimistic that we'll get the right people in eventually that have that are trained on kind of Russia and China in particular, that are kind of groomed to be senior leaders, and are best equipped, like in the Cold War, to face off against the Soviet Union, to deal with enduring challenges of Russia and China. We don't, think about who we have in leadership right now. We have folks that grew up in government, in part with a large portion of their time consumed by the global war on terror. We don't have those Russia hands. It would be great to see, a national security advisor that was steeped, or a deputy national security advisor that was steeped in Russia and Ukraine. And I think, you framed it properly. It's not necessarily just about Russia, but it has to be balanced with Ukraine. There are a lot of folks that were almost too close to the Russia problem set and looked at everything through the Russia lens. How do we preserve our the possibility of a cooperative relationship with Russia? How do we avert a Cold War? That is what governed 20 years of policy with Putin that basically set us down the path of a confrontation. If we at every turn looked to, let's say, moderate our criticism of Russia because we want them to be cooperative on global war, terror, climate change, arms control. When you have a orange revolution unfold in Ukraine and Russia is playing a hand as the nefarious actor trying to steal that revolution, and we basically, sidestep criticism there and don't offer enough support to Ukraine because we don't want to upset Russia, that sends some powerful signals to Putin on what should be his behavior. And that was relatively early on. We're talking about 20 plus years of a consistent, approach where Putin thought that he could prey on our hopes and fears and effectively act with impunity. And even now, we're still deeply governed. We're starting to kind of shed some of this baggage, but we're still deeply governed by fears of escalation that are misplaced, that we don't recognize that in fact that the imperative for Putin is regime survival, and regime survival necessitates avoiding a confrontation with NATO, and therefore there is pretty much nothing that we could do except for direct confrontation with Russia that would precipitate a conflict. So that means we could provide all the support we know that Ukraine needs, that Ukraine is asking for, with almost no risk. But we're still colored by what happens if Russia collapses, what happens if Russia loses too badly, what happens if there's an escalation, even though the U.S. government has clearly gotten a lot more comfortable about escalation and the limited risk of escalation. That's why we have Patriots and Abrams tanks coming in, but we're not there yet, and it's going to take a generation of folks that probably have a broader regional understanding and have been raised on understanding the challenges of Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and its what formerly was known as the Near Abroad, or that could prescribe policy recommendations that are not purely Kremlin centric, that are not the kinds of policies that precipitate the Chicken Kiev speeches out there, or insufficient support when this war first started 9 years ago. But it takes a long time for the bureaucracy to catch up.
Yes.
I wrote about this piece in the summer. I think it was called "Stop Tiptoeing Around Russia." I laid out in detail kind of the dearth of expertise in this area.
Well, considering all of that, considering the great euphoria over Biden's visit, the optics that it gave, the continuing war, where we need resources, what we could do better. Can you take a stab at what the next 3 months might look like? I'm not even going to say year, because that's just we didn't even predict we would be here a year ago. We just didn't. And so, but do we know what a spring might look like? Or do you have a sense of what we should be looking for as journalists, as constituents, as citizens?
I'm going to be ambitious there, and I'm going to take a stab at the next year.
Oh, great.
Since I wrote a piece, I wrote an article about this. What we're facing is already kind of an evolving Russian offensive with thus far limited gains. Russia is going to continue to pour thousands of troops in. Ukraine is almost surely going to successfully defend. Successfully defend means that they might have to give up territory, but they're basically sapping the strength of the Russian army. Eventually, we're going to get to the point where Russia culminates and runs out of offensive capability and switches to the defense. That is what happened in the prelude to the Battle of Kharkiv and Kherson, where Ukraine liberated massive swaths of territory. That's what we're facing probably in the late spring, summer, maybe late summer timeframe. And we should recognize that Russia gets relatively weaker every day. Ukraine gets relatively stronger every day this war continues. Russia doesn't have trained personnel. It's burning through its equipment, digging deep into Soviet-era equipment. Ukraine is getting advanced Western equipment in significant numbers. It's getting thousands, tens of thousands of its troops trained. It's keeping them in reserve for this counteroffensive that they're planning, and really kind of fighting out what they have currently on the front line. Lots of reserve troops in play. So what you could see is Ukraine, low probability that Ukraine is going to really kind of, let's say, destroy the Russian military entirely, meaning that they achieve such a staggering operational strategic effect. Let's say they break all the way through to Mariupol and sever the ground lines to Crimea. You could see that resulting in a collapse of the Russian lines in general. That's maybe a little bit far-fetched, but you could see Ukraine making significant gains, threatening Russian limited supply lines, and probably starting to threaten Crimea in a way that ultimately compels Russia to start to think about negotiations, where Putin, recognizes that he doesn't have the military means to achieve his political aims, switches to more earnest negotiations and looks to retain some of the gains that he had, from this year, past year of war, or from 2014. And the longer this war goes, the less chance that Ukraine is going to be willing to negotiate. So I think it gets dangerous in the 6 to 9 month time horizon, where Ukraine has been successful, sees an opportunity to potentially reestablish its internationally recognized borders, and then is less apt to negotiate. And that's probably about the same time that Putin then starts to consider negotiating, and there's going to be a huge mismatch there. And then he has to decide whether he escalates to nuclear weapons, because that'll be the only thing he has left, or because he may very well do another call up, but that is unlikely to do the trick. The one game changer here is China. If China comes in with support, then we all have to kind of reevaluate how this war goes, and that could be a recipe for protracted proxy warfare. But otherwise, I think this war is gonna start to enter a negotiation phase. Still a hot war, but a negotiation phase, towards the end of this year.
Well, we look forward to seeing your predictions come true, and we are going to keep eyes on China. Thank you so much for your time today.
I appreciate it. I might just say one other thing. For the folks that would watch this podcast, I don't think this is going to be a revelation, but to the American public at large, I try to make this point that this is not simply about a humanitarian cause to help Ukraine liberate itself from oppression. It is not about kind of a democracy in a remote country. It's about the system, the rules-based international system at large. It's about direct risks to a system that has allowed the U.S. to prosper and flourish. And we should recognize that for a modest investment, for 5% of our defense budget, Russia has been rendered. Russia's conventional military capability has been rendered, irrelevant almost for a decade or two. That is a pretty effective use of a defense budget. So I think it's important to recognize that this is directly in U.S. national security interest. So thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation and talk to your listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, visit carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.